Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Achmadi, and I'm a senior lecturer in architectural design at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning of the University of Melbourne. I'm presenting a paper today as part of the first panel of the ACAHUCH Symposium, Navigating Encounters and Exchange. The first panel focused on the flows of labor, craft, and vision across the region. My paper is titled Asia-Pacific Encounters on the Trails of Colonial Shipping Networks. A lasting legacy of 19th century colonialism in the Pacific and Southeast Asia is the fragmented historiography of the region's colonial built environment. Boundaries established by European colonization continue to govern the production of historical studies as these generally adopt geographical framework corresponding to the nation states that emerge from the particular colonial empires. Overlooked by this paradigm is the region's intricate interconnectivities in the late 19th century. The industrialization of agricultural production and the emergence of international commercial shipping routes open up territories while facilitating fluid movement of goods, labor, capital, and travelers. Crossing colonial boundaries, regional networks developed by commercial entities transformed the region in the late colonial era while forming a sense of Asia-Pacific as a colonial, a cosmopolitan cultural geography. It transformed the region in the late colonial era and forming a sense of Asia-Pacific as a region. They left behind build traces in the form of buildings for trade, travel network, and export-oriented agriculture. This paper seeks to bring into view the architectural settings of such commercial enterprises and the cross-cultural encounters they entailed. The paper itself will focus on the architectural infrastructure emerging in the key sites through tracing the interregional operation of the Australian firm Burnsville and the Dutch company KPM. Their networks and operation across the region not only facilitated rapid industrialization and agricultural production in Asia Pacific, but they also intertwined with the development of tourism. Drawing onto collection of 19th and early 20th century photograph of the Pacific and Southeast Asia from the Burnsville and KPM archive held in Australia and Singapore, as well as travel guides published by the two companies during the first 2-3 decades of the 20th century. This paper will examine images of mostly anonymous commercial built forms from across the regions, and I will reflect on how the production of this built infrastructure was informed entirely by interconnectivities and movement across borders. They reveal a picture of cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitan aspiration that were transmitted and shared across the Asia-Pacific region. These represent a network of connectivity that seems hard to imagine out of the dispersed geography and the landscape of nation-building politics of the subsequent century, as we see today. The global turn in architectural historiography has taken place in the last 10 to 20 years. And in that context, there's a gradual shift of our attention towards shared history of formation and transformation of architectural culture across the world, which shift our focus towards moment of connections between places that encapsulate and reflect migrations of ideas, craftsmanship, materiality, labor, as well as aspiration in the way we build and shape our urban environments and the way settlements were evolved through the history of civilization. And when we are looking into the colonial history of Asia Pacific, we cannot avoid dealing with resources extraction, industrialization, and commerce. The backbone of expansion of European empires into Asia Pacific is extraction of natural resources and industrialization of agricultural production. resource extraction is at the backbone of colonialism across Asia Pacific. So some of the works that inform my research as featured here show us those movement across borders and the fluidity of labor migrations and the subsequent impact on the formation of built environments at this site of resources extraction and intensification of agricultural activities in colonial Asia Pacific. What my research also follow through is the movement of those agency across border, such as photographers. On this slide is you can see an image of Walter Woodbury, an English photographer who travel across the world from England to Victoria in Australia in the middle of the gold rush in the second half of the 19th century, and spent a couple of years in Victoria to establish himself as a photographer before he eventually traveled to Asia and then decided to settle in Batavia and established one of the largest and most prolific commercial photography studio in the Dutch East Indies. So you can see in this captured in the work of Walter Woodbury in his partnership with James Page, is a production of visual recordings of our region that occurred outside the constraint of or kind of the envisioning of the territory according to either the Dutch colonial government or the colonial vision outside the Netherlands. In this case, Walter Woodbury moved across to colonial territories from Australia to the Dutch East Indies. And in his work, we can capture a shifting landscape that are clearly associated with the transformative impact of industrialization of agricultural production and globalization of trade network. And this, when we consider architecture history in the context of the wider history of colonialism in late 19th century, we shift our focus from looking at this monumental structure of the work of prominent colonial architects, in this case, the work of Dutch architects in the Netherlands, East Indies. We shift our focus towards almost anonymous but substantial landscape of built infrastructure associated with colonial agriculture and expansion of trading network across colonies. So we start looking into this landscape of resource extraction. We start shifting our focus from a landmark civic buildings at the heart of administrative center into the hinterland, into the region where we encounter, where there is a moment of cross-cultural encounters that involve, in some case, reinvention of local tradition as well as displacement of indigeneity. So, in this subsequent part of the project, I'm going to take you through a series of building infrastructures and visual representation of movement across borders as encapsulated in the history of two international shipping companies, the Dutch KPM and Burnsville. KPM was established in 1888 in Batavia and Rotterdam with regional offices across Dutch East Indies, as well as outside Dutch East Indies in Singapore, as well as here in Australia. And the second company I'll be looking at is Burnsville, which was established in Townsville and with multiple headquarters, in Sydney, but with multiple regional offices across South Pacific, as well as in Dutch East Indies. So both shipping companies produce substantial tourist illustrated travel document promoting their routes across Asia Pacific region and the capacity of their shipping companies of facilitating expansion of trading enterprises across the region. I would like to show you here is one of the document of that publication. KPM published 360-page illustrated guide to promote travel across Asia Pacific, linking Australia, Papua, and Dutch East Indies, and Europe. And what is fascinating about this type of publication by the two shipping companies is the traces of multiple commercial entities that not necessarily comply to this whole notion of the connection between the metropole and the colony. So in this document, it showcased multiple companies operating in the Dutch East Indies that were originally established in Australia or in Singapore. And you see in this advertisement that promote all these small companies and enterprises, you identify this movement across the distribution of commodities across borders, which imply that there's already an existing network between the producer and consumers elsewhere. So we're no longer seeing the dynamic and enterprises operating within a particular colonies, but across multiple colonies in Asia Pacific. For example, there is this company on the far right showcasing a company based in Singapore specializing in cold storage. And they are also importers of Australian frozen meat, produce and fresh fruits. The advertisement next to it on the left is about a particular immigration agency that specializes in facilitating movement of goods from Australia to Dutch East Indies, in particular the importing of Australian butter, pork and ham to Java, which was already densely populated at that time. Clearly it was identified as one of an important market for commodities produced here in Australia. And there's multiple British enterprises operating in the Dutch East Indies, more so, and including this Harrison and Crossfield, which had a substantial operation in Sumatra, particularly in the tobacco and rubber plantation. Now, KPM operate across the Dutch East Indies. This is it was a very extensive shipping operation linking Dutch East Indies primarily to Europe, but also expanding its operation across South Pacific by overlapping its operation, its network with Burnsville. This is a very substantial organization, and in major port settlements across the Dutch East Indies, the presence of KPM could be seen from the scale of architectural artifact associated with this enterprise. Each of their buildings were designed by the most prominent one of the most prominent architects in the Dutch East Indies. And each of the building carried that civic gesture. They were also heavily involved in the establishment of early infrastructure of tourism on the island of Bali, in areas that are closely related with major agricultural industry. Because there is a very close connection between the expansion of agricultural plantation across the Dutch East Indies as well as South Pacific, with the emergence of key destination of the traveling industry at that time. KPM also have a substantial operation based in Singapore. And the building associated with KPM operation, this is their head office in Singapore, were designed by key architects operating in Singapore at that time. In this, and it was designed by Keys and Dowd as well. It was a building that was the first building equipped with elevator. So it symbolized the ambition and the confidence of KPM as a shipping company that facilitate a very busy traffic of movement of goods, commodities, as well as travelers through the first decade of the 20th century. Similarly to KPM, Burnsfield left behind an extensive built infrastructure. Excuse me. Across the east coast of Australia, they established their presence, starting from Townsville, starting point when the company was established, until they established their main head office in Sydney. And all of the buildings across Australia carry that civic presence, not unlike what the legacy of KPM. And their operation in South Pacific signal an even greater role in the way that it's not just a series of quite handsomely designed building, but it's an important structure that somehow anchor a process of urbanization in those major port settlements in South Pacific. So they established an important presence in Papua, in Suva, in Apia, and it's all kind of signaling the crucial role that this company played as South Pacific also emerged as major agricultural production for multiple European colonies at that time. In Dutch East Indies, they in fact also established their head office to facilitate the expansion of their interest in agricultural enterprise, including a kapuk plantation in East Java and copra plantation in Sulawesi. So the building on the lower left in Surabaya, occupied by Burnsfield as their head office in Dutch East Indies. Burnsfield also actively participated in trading expo that frequently took place in Java at the time. So this is a photograph of their pavilion at the expo in Semarang in 1925, showcasing Australian goods to Javanese visitors and also European visitors at that time. Semarang is, of course, a very important trading and sugar plantation, important center of trading activities in Java. It's the heart of sugar plantation expansion across the island. And the image on the right showcase facilities and sheds associated with Burnsfield kapuk plantation in East Java. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to take you through another type of building associated with the production, the expansion of Burnsfield operation in South Pacific. This is the veranda. This is a photograph of a residence belonging to Burnsfield manager in Samarai, British New Guinea. And image on the right, it's a photograph of the veranda of a similar type of building. So it's a residence of BP's manager. What I would like you to have a look at is this combination of timber craftsmanship that highlight how this built infrastructures that were established across border is a site of cultural encounters where different ideas and craftsmanship were put together and combined and generating something new. So I'm interested in showing the furniture featured on in this veranda, which is typical of the type of chair that can be found in across the island of Java. And in a way that the fact that this chair, which came from the island of Java to be featured outside the Dutch East Indies during colonial era is fascinating. And you can see that this timber craftsmanship is quite distinct from the art of timber craftsmanship in Papua. So this indicates this process of movement across borders, and some of the managers are working for plantation enterprises across the region were moving across these colonies and carry with their movement these traces, these memories of different cultural landscape that they've encountered as they took part in the establishment of industrialization, agriculture industry across the Asia Pacific region. This is another picture that showcases a copra planters residence in Rabaul. Burnsfield also involved in kind of facilitating establishment of copra plantation across the South Pacific, including and some location in Eastern Indonesia. And what I would like to shift from that, associated with that typology of this residence of shipping companies residents, shipping company manager and managers of plantation, is this typology, this residences that were built using local building materials and the craftsmanship that some of the laborers were familiar with. And there's a certain similarity that you can see in this building. And this is a drawing. And this drawing is also a very fascinating evidence of this movement across borders and the cross-cultural moment that inform the construction of such building. So this is a drawing of Burnsfield and Co. Mess bungalow for plantation employees in Rabaul. It was drawn in Sydney by this timber and joinery and builder supply merchants. And the company itself was based in Pyrmont in Sydney. So a drawing produced in Sydney for a structure to be constructed in Rabaul. And for me, and there's a possible third connection. It's not only just between Sydney and Rabaul, but also perhaps to places in Dutch East Indies. This is really very speculative, but the feature, the elevation of the floor, the use of the type of roof shape, resonates strongly. The type of building across Dutch East Indies, this typically residents of prominent member of indigenous communities across Indonesia. This idea of elevation is quite common, but the particular, the monumentality of the roof shape and the symmetrical form and the use of verandas around circulating the building showcase a certain type of building, and in different part of Dutch East Indies, plantation estate typically adopt that approach in establishing accommodation for kind of the upper level of employment in those companies, and such as these are the typical typology of residents of tobacco planters in Eastern Sumatra, which was widely constructed throughout the region in the last 2-3 decades of the 19th century. There's a clear elevation of the floor and a very monumental entrance and the veranda circling the structure. So to summarize my presentation, having surveyed built infrastructure associated with the operation of two international shipping companies, Burns Philp Australian company with extensive operation across South Pacific, Eastern Australia, and Eastern Dutch East Indies, and KPM, the Dutch shipping company, we encountered buildings that were produced as this company facilitate movement of labors, commodities, and vision of commercial industry, industrialization, and this in those buildings you see that they are not particularly designed to translate certain colonial vision or agenda in establishing the identity of a particular colonial entity, but these are buildings that facilitate what those trading enterprises require, and it's also facilitate this aspiration to be part of a regional trading network. And I think we, in sort of encountering these buildings that operate in between colonies across borders, it really challenged our thinking of the way we shape architecture historiography in dealing with Asia Pacific. So in overall, my research projects seek to position architecture historiography in the context of that forgotten past where Asia Pacific operate as an interconnected network of sites of agricultural production and enterprise, commercial enterprise, and it brings into view colonial Asia Pacific as interconnected region, a field of exchanges and colonial encounters. And drawing from multiple collection of 19th century and early 20th century photograph held across different part of Asia Pacific as well as in Europe, we start seeing this connection emerging to the foreground. To some extent, again, the fact that all of these materials were scattered around the world, though the archival collections that I rely on is this research scattered around the world, indeed kind of again showcase this very internalized internationalization movement of also memories and traces. These are anonymous commercial built forms across region, and their production and their presence outside the core of colonial administrations, whether it is Dutch East Indies or Australia. It gives us a reminder of the extensive interconnectivity and movement that were part of colonial history. So this provide, I hope this research work, this preliminary research work and preliminary data that I've worked with and show you in this presentation, it also provide a new context in thinking about the broader discourse, heritage discourses of Asia Pacific. It calls for a consideration of built heritage in the region that focus on the interconnectivities and movement of labors and goods across 19th century colonial Asia Pacific. Thank you.